studied a sample of 143 patients, depressed patients, to evaluate whether intrinsic religiosity was associated with better outcomes in these patients, quality of life, another important outcome, and whether resilience could be a pathway to explain these differences in these patients. We know in literature that depression is a very important thing in mental health. Many patients suffering from depression, and we know that religiosity is a protective factor in mainly studies in meta-analysis. But we actually don't know whether intrinsic religiosity can protect, and how can this happen in these patients. So we evaluated in our study all these things, and we compared two groups of patients with higher intrinsic religiosity and lower scores on intrinsic religiosity. And we identify in these patients that patients with higher intrinsic religiosity at discharge present higher quality of life, a higher amplitude of improvement in the symptoms, and higher resilience scores. It's a very, very important finding. It's the first study in this kind of sample in the world. We have previous studies from in other situations, in other settings, but this is the first one to identify in these severe depressed patients a protective effect of religiosity, intrinsic religiosity. And we also identified that these patients had lower suicide attempts. That's a very important thing. And we have this hypothesis whether resilience can be another pathway to understand the relationship of religiosity and health, could mediate these effects of religiosity and health. One finding in our study that was published in Journal of Affective Disorders, we can assess details and things like that, is that the patients with higher religiosity in admission have higher symptoms, depressive symptoms, general psychological symptoms, and we try to understand why this happened, why these patients were with higher symptoms in admission. One hypothesis we can talk is about negative coping. It's somewhat one way to understand this kind of thing. Patients were more religious, but with negative coping. But the main hypothesis we address is that we know that religiosity is a protective effect for suicide attempt. So these patients with this protection of religiosity are admitted under more severe conditions compared to the patients with lower religiosity. So this may explain why they were with worse symptoms. But despite that, these patients had lower suicide attempts. They were with higher symptoms but lower suicide attempts. They report more quality of life and more resilience. That's our finding, very surprising finding in our study. In the next step, we are trying to understand is about the biological markers that may explain this relationship. Why patients with higher religiosity have positive effects on depression?